All right, hi everyone. How's it going? I am here with Ami from Ami1649, Ami or Yvonne's Nightmare. um, I'll link his channel below, but so we're here to talk about Ariel by Sylvia Plath, and I don't know if it's going to be reversed like that in the final product, but right now, as I'm seeing it, the title is reversed. Well, it's not in yours, at least in my view. Whatever. um, so, um, so we got to get. So Ami asked me to sort of get on Zoom and chat about Ariel with him, and so we're just going to talk about a few of the poems and see what happens. Um, yeah. We'll see. But so shall we just start with the first poem so we picked out 6 poems, by the way. And shall we just start with the first one that appears?
Yeah, let's do
The
it.
applicant.
Perfect.
So what verses did you find interesting in this one?
So in this one, I don't have a particular verse
Okay.
highlighted. How about you?
So the first thing that I underlined was, will you marry it? Will you marry it? It is guaranteed to thumb shut your eyes at the end and dissolve of sorrow.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting because the poem is called The Applicant, which makes me think of a job application. But it seems to also be about marriage, and it seems to compare starting a job as being married, and it also seems to be commenting on marriage itself too, and maybe that's the point. But I thought that the idea of getting a job as getting married to a profession as an interesting idea. And I think I find it interesting because it makes me think of some people who are like workaholics and like who live to work, who don't work to live, you know? And I think I find that idea interesting because I'm generally a very lazy person. So people who are workaholics fascinate me. And then she repeats, will you marry it? And says after that, it is waterproof, shatterproof, proof against fire and bombs through the roof. Believe me, they'll bury you in it. And I found that interesting with the repetition of the word proof, because it actually made me think of a mathematical proof. And it made me think back to the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, because I remember a teacher in high school saying that title was probably punning on proof as well. But then the roof part was interesting too, because it made me think of like glass ceiling, and Sylvia Plath is a woman, and so it wasn't the norm at the time for the woman in a marriage to work. And I also found the part believe me, they'll bury you in it. So bury you in
I think the suit though, right?
Yeah, in the suit. They'll bury you in the suit. And it seemed like it's sort of has a double meaning, I felt like, as well. So they'll bury you in the suit that we're referring to, but also they'll bury you in work, or bury you in your job, or bury you in your marriage.
It's a lifetime commitment, so to speak. You're like, yeah, you're chaining yourself for life, maybe.
Yeah.
So it's always in Sylvia Plath's poems and poetry in general, there's an exercise in trying to like understand what the scene is, like who are the characters, and what exactly is going on. And so my reading could be incorrect, and there might be a better, more correct reading. But my understanding of the scene here is that I'm imagining a male salesperson, and he's talking to another male, and he's showing off a female body, but the female has no agency. She has no voice. There's like a line. It's done. She says she's yeah. I think they say she's naked at one point. Here he is. I notice. Oh, he's naked. I notice you are stark naked. How about the suit? But oh yeah, here it is. A living doll. Everywhere you look, it can sew, it can cook, it can talk. So they're talking about this like body, this like woman that he's trying to sell him on. I think, and it's like a very haunting kind of sense of like objectification, which I think is like a theme that comes up throughout like a lot of the poetry. It's just like the discerning and impersonal gaze, and you get that in like the poems where she's like a patient in the hospital, and there's like the medical examination. This is sort of like the examination in the context of like a sale. Someone's like selling a body or something, or trying to make a transaction. So that's sort of the way I read it.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. What do you think? So the woman in this play you've thought up for it, is the woman the applicant, and there's one man who's sort of vouching for her and one man who's she's applying for, or is the man a salesman trying to sell the woman?
Yeah.
Weird.
Well, here's my clue. Here's my clue. In the appendix, we have the same version, right? So we both have appendices. In Appendix 2, there's Sylvia Plath's introduction to the poem. Now, this might not even be relevant because, like, obviously, I mean, you can argue what Sylvia Plath said about this poem is completely irrelevant, and that's a fair point. But this, I just saw as like maybe a little bit of a clue that was sort of helpful for me to sort of solidify the image in my head, which I've sort of developed. So she says in this beginning of Appendix 2, in this poem called The Applicant, the speaker is an executive, a sort of exacting super salesman. He wants to be sure the applicant for his marvelous product really needs it and will treat it right. So I imagine, that's what I'm imagining. The super salesman has this marvelous product. The marvelous product, she can cook, she can clean, she can sew. And that sort of, yeah, that was my clue to sort of that reading, if that makes sense.
Okay. No, yeah, I hadn't read. Didn't even notice the appendices in the book. But no, I think that's interesting. It kind of sounds like it's funny because it relates to a movie I was watching. Not a movie, a show I was watching the other day. But it's like a matchmaker in olden days when they had matchmakers, and you would be like, oh, one family's like, oh, we have a daughter, oh, we have a marriageable son. We're gonna like have them meet and see if they like each other, and it makes me think of that too.
Yeah, but it's such a dark poem then. Like the way I sort of envision it, like it's horrific, right? It's like it's like two men talking about a woman like an object, like a piece of cattle. Like it's like a very, very dark image. And then one part of this poem, which I can't really explain, or I love it. I think it's wonderful and cool, but like I have no explanation for it. It's just even the first stanza. First, are you our sort of person? Do you wear a glass eye, false teeth, or a crutch, a brace or a hook, rubber breasts, or a rubber crotch, stitches to show something's missing? No. Like that part, I don't even understand, but it's crazy.
Yeah, no, and it with the glass eye, false teeth, or a crutch, I don't know, it makes me think of like plastic surgery or something. But the sort of, again, with the objectification you were talking about and the focus on the look of the woman and so forth. I also find the verse out just after that, then how can we give you a thing? It's like, I don't know, because when I first read that, I was like, then how can we give you a thing? And for some reason, and there were, again, two ways I saw that. There was, how can we give you a thing, as in why should we give you anything? Just a way of saying we should give you nothing based on this. But also, why should we give you a thing, as though there's this set of things that we might give you? Why should we give you any one of them? And I don't know why I read it like that at first, but I did. Yeah. Which suggests that there's multiple possible outcomes, I suppose.
Right. I just sort of want to walk back a little bit.
Yeah.
The idea that like Sylvia Plath's reading is correct. Like I'm not convinced that little introduction is like the way to read. You know what I'm saying? Because like I don't want to sort of monopolize. Like I don't want to suggest like that is the correct reading, because I don't think that's true at all. You know.
Yeah. No.
It's ambiguous, and it can be read in many different ways. You know.
Yeah. No. For sure. I do like, this is going off topic, but I do get annoyed with people who are like, oh yeah, well the author said here, or the film director said here about this, so you're wrong. It's like, well, that doesn't matter. If I can point to XYZ in the thing, then I can support what I'm saying. So,
right.
Yeah.
And the reason it's so great is because it's so ambiguous. You know, it's great because it's not so clear. It's like kaleidoscopic, and that's the point. You know, if it was like a simple scene, then you know it would have been more explicit, but it's not. So that's the power. Yeah.
But I think it's interesting. The idea you have was interesting because in the next to last verse, she says, "My boy, it's your last resort," and a resort made me think of like whatever, a theme park or like a resort that you go to. And I think that touches on something that becomes more prominent in Lady Lazarus, which we'll get to in a second, where theater becomes a big aspect in the poem. And there's obviously theater in the situation that you were talking about, and in this poem too. So
yeah. And like last resort, I mean, this poem for me is just like the cruelty and like the finality the desperation of like human relationships, like spousal marriage relationships, you know, like it's such a dark vision of like a man and woman pairing off. Like it doesn't get darker than that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to think that there are places in the world where this still happens, and that it used to be common in most places where people would meet like 2 or 3 times and then get married, you know, and that was life.
But even
so
in our society, like you could really feel trapped in a relationship,
yeah.
you know, if it's not good.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I mean, even still, like people from a certain background, you know, two people are in a relation that maybe isn't that serious, but then pregnancy occurs and they feel obligated to stick together for it, you know, and that can, yeah,
Totally.
yeah, cool.
Should we go to the next one?
Now we move on, yeah. So, Lady Lazarus. Well, I begin with the applicant. Do you want to begin with Lady Lazarus?
Sure. So this, I mean, yeah, this is a super. I think it's my favorite poem, which might be a very like unoriginal thing to say because like it's probably everyone's favorite Sylvia Plath poem. But I really love it, and so what I highlighted, because like one of these themes that I've been thinking about as I was reading this book and thinking about these particular poems is this theme of like the examination or like the exhibition. And we mentioned before like the examination of like the woman as like object, and there's also, we're going to see in other poems and maybe even in this poem, the examination of woman as like or the body on like the medical table, like in the hospital. And then here she has on the top of page 15, so it's like halfway through the poem, the peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see them unwrap me hand and foot, the big strip tease. And so this image of her in the hospital and you know, coming back from her suicide attempt, and she calls it a big strip tease. Again, it's like this objectifying gaze, and connecting it, of course, to like the way in which there's an objectifying gaze and like a sexual strip tease kind of a thing.
Yeah, I wrote the word circus next to that. I don't know why that term reminded me of the circus, but
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, even the first verse, I have done it again. Like I've done a magic trick, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. So, I mean, this poem ends so strong. I mean, this poem gives me chills. I get chills down my spine when I get to the end of this poem. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading this poem, and also other poems, is that there's like an element of like body horror in her poetry. There's like the poem "Cut" has that too, when she like cuts her finger. And other poems, she's like obsessed with like imagery of like blood and gore. She's interested in playing in the space between life and death. She does that in a bunch of poems. Some of them we'll look at, and like it's very often coded in a kind of like aggressive stance. I think like you can imagine like, you know, other artists who sort of play with this. Like, or think of Nietzsche, for example, right? Friedrich Nietzsche, where he talks about like vaulting beyond good and evil and implacability of purpose and things like that. And it's like very outward focused, like it's like a kind of power which is like manifest at the world. Whereas like Sylvia Plath's like power is like aimed at herself. It's like a violence to her own body with this description of her suicides. And it's like she finds redemption in like being violent and being aggressive towards herself.
Yeah, no, interesting. That makes sense, though, given her history.
Yeah, but like at the end of this poem, right? Because the poem describing her suicides, and out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. It's like this violent, and it's like an image of redemption. It's like the phoenix coming back to life, and the redemption though is like a violence against herself, you know, which is so dark.
Although, I mean, she's saying she eats men, not she eats herself.
Right, that's true.
Although it's funny because she says, "I eat men like air," and I'm like, "You don't eat air."
Right, that's just such a strange image.
Yeah, that's interesting. Have you listened to the audio recording of her reading this poem? Because she adds some verses in that.
Oh, really?
In that version, yeah.
I didn't know that.
So I think when she says, "Peel off the napkin, oh my enemy, do I terrify?" In the version that's in the audio, she says, "Yes, yes, Herr Professor, it is I. Do you deny the nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth, and so on and so forth?" Yeah, so she has some interesting additions in that audio one. And I know there's one more near the end, but I don't know if I will recall it off the top of my head. I had this poem memorized for donkey's years, but yeah. So what popped out at me in this poem was the association with theater, like you were talking about with the circus. You were talking about that, and the opening line being like, "I've done this magic trick," and her being showed off as though it's like as though she's some sort of an exhibit. And when she says, the famous verses here, "Dying is an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I have a call." And I thought that was interesting because whenever I read poems, a lot of times I start to look for puns, and I thought call, okay, so you have a calling, dying is an art, and that's so on. But also I thought, she has a call from hell or somewhere, she has to go to the underworld now, or to hell or the heaven or something. And in the near the end, there was a very large charge for a word or a touch or a bit of blood, which goes into what you were saying about blood. But the word charge is like, there's money, but then there's also sort of the responsibility, like, this is your charge, this is your responsibility.
Yeah. But I thought I could be wrong, but I thought the charge was like paying money to see the exhibit, right?
Yeah,
yeah, exactly, right.
And it could be but it could also be a charge, as in people might be stampeding to go see her.
Right.
That's what I love about puns. But when it was a couple of years ago when I was reading Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, when I realized that I think that this poem is in conversation with that poem. And I think earlier today I was thinking to myself I should have that poem by my side so I can reference it, but I forgot. So but that's the poem that I've always seen as kind of about the making of art, and this is too, in the sense of the exhibit like you were talking about.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, and this is the first poem, I think, where she starts with the sort of Nazi imagery, which will become especially prominent in Daddy. But I always find it interesting, her use of that, but we can talk about that when we get to Daddy, because there's so much of it in that. But
yeah. Should we move on?
Sure. We've got Tulips. Okay, Tulips. Yes. So Tulips. God, I love this poem.
Me too. I realized how much I loved it after you said we need to add this to the list, and I went back. I was like, oh my god, this is like also one of my absolute favorite.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. The first stanza is like one of the most perfect things ever.
You want to read it?
Yeah. Sure. The tulips are too excitable. It is winter here. Look how white everything is. How quiet. How snowed in. I'm learning peacefulness, lying by myself quietly as the light lies on these white walls, this bed, these hands. I am nobody. I have nothing to do with explosions. I have given my name and my day clothes up to the nurses, and my history to the anesthetist, and my body to surgeons. Yeah.
That's so good.
It's just, yeah, it's like so many of these, so it's interesting to finally actually be like delving into these poems, because so many of the poems that I love by Sylvia Plath, I sort of loved on a purely kind of musical basis, where I just was so in love with the words that I didn't dig deeper into I mean, I got the general meaning and so forth, but I basically experienced them sort of like I would experience a song without words, which is ironic since it's a poem. But so now, having like looked over these poems and tried to like actually sort of parcel out meanings aside from just superficial stuff, I think obviously in this first stanza she's talking about the sort of feeling of the loss of self you get when you have all these people sort of doing things to you in the hospital. and it's just evoked so powerfully. It's like, I don't know, it's just not something that I ever thought of. Maybe it's because I've never, well, I mean, yeah, no, I've never like had a severe I mean, I've had like wisdom teeth out, but that's not like a huge deal. But I've never like had myself admitted to a hospital or something, or needed to be admitted to a hospital or something like that. So it may just be something I never thought of, but it's just one of those phenomena that when it takes a writer to write about it like this to make you think how weird it is, I guess, you know?
Yeah. And I think of it as like the objectifying gaze again, which I keep coming back to. It's like the human being without agency and just becoming like an object, and in this case, an object in a hospital.
Yeah.
So along those lines, I sort of marked two stanzas down after that. Like, my body is a pebble to them. They tend it as water tends to the pebbles. It must run over, smoothing them gently. They bring me numbness in their bright needles. They bring me sleep. Now I have lost myself. I am sick of baggage. And then also this amazing line. So I'm skipping a few lines, but skipping one line. My husband and child smiling out of the family photo. Their smiles catch onto my skin, little smiling hooks. That's a crazy line.
Yeah. Yeah. The what do you think of the fact that she refers to them as hooks?
Yeah, the way I read this poem is she's in a state, like she's in a moment where she sees herself hovering between life and death. It's also in Fever 103. I think we get a similar kind of moment where she's like, the description of her illness in that poem, and I think other poems as well, where she's like reveling in this space where she's like, she sees, the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. And then this image of this tulips, which they're too excitable. And then towards the end, she, I think, talks more about the tulips, how, like she says, before they came, the air was calm enough, coming and going breath by breath without any fuss. Then the tulips filled it up like a loud noise. So the tulips are like disrupting this state that she's in. She's in this like liminal white space, this transitional space between life and death. And this red tulips are like interfering like with this, like with a totally sanitized room that she's imagining herself in. And I read the line about the photo in a similar way. Like, these are hooks, which are like bringing her, which are like piercing her into reality, which she's like trying to clean herself from.
Yeah. It's her earthly tether.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wonder though whether the tulips are also in opposition to the family in the photo, because obviously the tulips themselves have no association with the family, and she might, in the tulips as well, see this alternative. If she were to come out of this sterilized place where she implies in one stanza, I think, that she sort of wants to die. If she comes out, she sees the possibility of just returning to her domestic life, but then she sees this possibility with these tulips, and she describes them with so much, so beautifully. She sees all these alternative lives she could be living if she weren't stuck in this, sort of, domestic situation for a woman at the time, basically. Yeah.
And then also in this poem, and I think also in Fever 103, the language of purity comes up. She says, the water went over my head. I'm a nun now. I've never been so pure. And so, like, in this state of transition where she's hovering maybe between life and death, there's like she feels absolutely empty and pure.
Yeah, and why when the tulips are too red in the first place, they hurt me, she says later. That would connect with that, because they're becoming red now, which isn't as pure as white. And goes back to the whole blood imagery you were talking about. Yeah.
And then just an amazing line from this poem. She's talking about the closing of the tulips. I imagine them shutting their mouths. Here, let me take a step back. How free it is. You have no idea how free. The peacefulness is so big it dazes you. And it asks it asks nothing, a name, a tag, a few trinkets. It is what the dead close on, finally. I imagine them shutting their mouths on it like a communion tablet. I just find that line so powerful.
It makes me think a little bit of something that I've been told about something that Jean-Paul Sartre, I think, wrote, or something like that. One of these existentialists that when you stand next to a cliff, you're anxious, you feel arousal, but it's not fear of falling, it's the fear of the fact that you could choose to just jump.
Yeah.
And it seems to touch on a similar idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I in the very last stanza she says, and I am aware of my heart, it opens and closes its bowl of red blooms out of sheer love of me. Um and I put a bracket around that and said she lives despite herself. There's something in her heart that's drawing her back to life. And I actually when I looked back at this poem, I thought it was kind of a companion piece for Lady Lazarus. They're both about a sort of resurrection where she goes through this dark place, but then it ends in light, although it seems much more solemn here. Lady Lazarus was like triumphant, I eat men. Here it's more like, oh, I guess if you insist, I'll go back out.
Yeah, I totally agree. Cool.
I think next we have Cuts.
Yeah, this is a fun one.
Yeah, it was actually my first exposure to Sylvia Plath was this poem.
Did you like it?
Yeah. No, it was like instant. It was like love at first sight when I read this poem. Yeah.
Nice.
Do you
want to read some of it?
Sure. What a thrill! My thumb instead of an onion, the top quite gone, except for a sort of hinge of skin, a flap like a hat, dead white, then that red plush. Little pilgrim, the Indians axed your scalp. Your turkey waddle carpet rolls straight from the heart. I step on it, clutching my bottle of pink fizz. A celebration this is. Out of a gap, a million soldiers run, redcoats every one. It's funny, I'm reading it now, I'm like, oh, there's a lot of like sort of Revolutionary era imagery. We have the Indians, we have a scalp, we have redcoats. And later on, she mentions the Ku Klux Klan, I think.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Oh man, that's crazy.
Yeah.
It's so good. Totally. It's such brutal imagery. And I think maybe, I don't know, maybe this is a silly reading, but in my mind, when I read this poem, what jumps out at me is that all these metaphors, she's like so many metaphors, right? Little pilgrim, the Indian axe your scalp, excuse me. The million soldiers running out, redcoats. You mentioned the stain on your gauze, Ku Klux Klan, and then trepanned veteran. This might be a silly reading, but it jumps out that they're like all such coded male images. It's like images of war and images like the characters of like men.
Yeah.
And I just see her like sort of appropriating sort of like that like male violent imagery into her own unique voice and own unique narrative, which is like in the kitchen slicing onions, like a domestic housewife, so to speak, with like with like a much smaller horizon of life in a way, because like the images that she's evoking are these like people who are like trying to conquer the world, or going into battle, or being extremely racist and violent in the racism, but like, and she's pulling from that in the context of like making a salad.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I like that. Yeah, and no, it's weird. It's sort of a glorification of her basically cutting herself. So this sort of romanticization of self-harm. I don't know. It's like, it's a bit of an unhealthy thought pattern, I suppose, but very honest. I mean, because a lot of there are people who do that, and I think it's very frank about that. I think it's Yeah, go on. I'm not sure what I'm saying, but go on.
No, I hear. I mean, if we're being honest, like putting Sylvia Plath aside, like who cares about her biography? But the voice of this poet, like the poetic voice, is like seems like a very unhealthy voice, you know, like in a way, psychologically speaking. But I just think for me it plays into a theme which comes up again and again, which is like a body horror. And you had it in Lady Lazarus, where she says, "Do I terrify?" Like you remove the gauze, do I terrify? She's like fascinated with like how frightful human gore can be. And it makes me think of like the artwork of like Francis Bacon, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with any of his paintings.
One painting, I think.
Yeah, but he was also like, he was a painter who painted like carcasses and like grotesque, because it's like this fascination with the grotesque form of the body.
Yeah, yeah. Makes me think of that Francisco de Goya painting, Saturn Devouring His Son.
Yeah, I love that. That's like amazing.
Creepiest painting ever.
Totally. Yeah.
To think he actually painted that in his actual dining room.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Amazing painting. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and so we have I think it's interesting. She uses the word homunculus.
Mm.
Oh, my homunculus, I am ill. And that makes me think of Goethe's Faust, where there's the character homunculus who appears for a while. This little man who lives inside of a glass case, who's sort of an artificial human. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So,
yeah,
I don't know where to go with it, but that's interesting. And another verse that I find very strange in this poem. So she says, it's in the Ku Klux, the part where she talks about the Ku Klux Klan. So saboteur, kamikaze man, the stain on your gauze, Ku Klux Klan, babushka.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's Russian for grandmother, I think.
I don't know.
Let's
look it up.
I think it is, but if it is, that's just such a strange word to interpolate right there,
Yeah. A granny. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. So, yeah, who knows?
Babushka darkens and tarnishes when the bald pulp of your heart confronts its small mill of silence. How you jump. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Trepanned veteran.
Trepanned, yeah. So trepanned is like a surgery, like a drilling of the skull for like that, like left you like a zombie, I think.
Cool.
Or maybe it's like release some pressure in the skull or something, but it was gruesome.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to make of the babushka thing, but
I don't know what to make of it, but I love it.
Yeah. No, it's something to ponder. Cool. Shall we move on?
Yeah, two more.
I have a big one now. Okay, Daddy. This was another poem I had memorized for a long time. This poem has so many just really kind of startling lines. I mean, Daddy, I have had to kill you. Mm-hmm. I mean, and there are others. Every woman adores a fascist.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and then Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. That's like just, in 21st century colloquial American English, mic drop. Yeah, I really like this poem. And it really is the one that starts to lean in very hard to the Nazi and it's a Holocaust imagery, which I've always found a bit odd. It's like, I don't know. She seems to compare herself to a Jew in the Holocaust, which I find very odd. I don't know how quite what I think of it. I feel like emotionally it works in the poem, but like zooming out, I just wonder how appropriate it is to use that sort of idea, I don't know.
It's interesting Rorschach test in terms of like how you view art and creative expression. Because I did read somewhere, I don't remember the details of who or when or where, but I remember some person was very offended by it. Mm-hmm. I mean, which makes sense, right? You'd imagine that some people would get offended. Yeah. But again, it comes down to like how are you reading this poem? Like can a poem written about a person's pain that's written sort of in the voice of someone who's like A, suffering, and B, somewhat narrow in their perspective, it seems, and somewhat petty in their views, uh, is that something that could be offensive? Like, I don't know. Yeah,
Well, now that you mentioned that the narrator is kind of perhaps petty and impetuous, that could be the point.
exactly.
The
Yeah,
narrator is also a problem person, like her father is, and like the husband she mentions.
yeah,
She also has issues, and so her use of this imagery is part of the sort of psychoanalysis of her, the narrator.
yeah. So that's how I would read it. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
no, that's
Yeah,
interesting. I like that.
yeah.
I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah, because the parts that talk about the Holocaust, like I think that musically speaking, they're incredibly powerful. They sound incredibly powerful. Um, you know, uh, my Polak friend says there are a dozen or two. Or, well, I'm starting in a weird spot, but so I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It's stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ich, 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 ich. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you, and the language obscene, an engine, chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. I've always found that when I think of the way Sylvia Plath narrates this poem, and I always hear "I think I may well be a Jew" in her voice, and it's always so like I think I may well be a Jew.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like she's literally sitting there thinking, like I don't know, it's kind of makes me laugh. I don't know, yeah. But
So for me, I read it the same way I sort of read Cut. So at the end of Cut, again, we had I'm the Kamikaze Man and the Ku Klux Klan and all these things, and it's like the tragedy and the irony and the sadness is that she's just like in her kitchen cutting an onion, you know.
mhm.
And so I sort of see it in like a similar way. Like there's something very very sad about this story. It seems to be like cycles of abuse and like repetition compulsion of like abusive relationships. That's sort of what I'm getting out of it, like with her father and this, maybe her husband. And like in that very sad environment, there's like pulling from these like over the top metaphors, this like fascistic imagery and things like that. It's like so extreme. But that distance, I think, is part of the effect. Like sort of the absurdity and the impossibility even of this comparison is part of like the tragedy or the emotional resonance of the poem.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, yeah. So I've always seen Sylvia Plath as a poet who kind of takes mundane everyday experiences and elevates them, obviously into poetry. And so it was interesting to hear you say that because well, I mean, it doesn't go against my former thought of thinking about her, but I don't know, that's interesting. I don't know what to say. Sorry. Um, yeah, this is a great poem. And they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of goes back to the body horror thing you were talking about.
Yeah.
Um, hmm.
With your Luftwaffe and your gobbledygoo.
Yeah.
What a comparison.
Yeah. That might be a Freudian slip though, because
Mm-hmm.
gobbledygook is such a silly word, right?
Right.
And she's using it just after she talks about the Luftwaffe,
Right.
and just after she talks about Dachau and Belsen and these other things.
Yeah.
So it could be a Freudian slip.
Yeah, and that line I love. That's the line that I highlighted, which is probably the most famous line. But like, every woman adores a fascist, the boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. The aesthetic of abuse and violence, I think, keeps recurring in these poems.
Yeah. And I mean, there is that. This so this is my area of expertise, but I remember from my undergrad in psychology learning about relationships. Uh, People do tend to be attracted to other people who see themselves in a similar people pe- people tend to be attracted to other people who see them in a way that they see
Mm,
themselves, you know. So if
mhm,
someone has low self-worth, they have a tendency to get into a relationship where the other person doesn't have a very high view of them. So that those lines about every woman adores a fascist kind of makes me think of that.
mhm.
um, so it sounds like she had uh, or at least this narrator had a very troubled relationship with her father, so she had a troubled relationship with her husband, and so on and so forth. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, we'll do
Last one.
last one. This is the one I'm least familiar with.
Hmm. I
Um,
love this one.
would you like to start?
Sure. Um, yeah, Fever 103. I think it just sort of plays on so many of these themes that we were talking about. Uh, it reminds me in many ways of Tulips, because she's going to describe this experience of having a fever and apparently being on the edge of death. So I think I'll start from like close to the middle. Um, Hothouse baby in its crib, the ghastly orchid hanging its hanging garden in the air. Devilish leopard, radiation turned it white and killed it in an hour, greasing the bodies of adulterers like Hiroshima ash, and eating in the sin, the sin. Darling, all night I have been flickering, off on, off on. The sheets grow heavy as a lecher's kiss. 3 days, 3 nights, lemon water, chicken water, water make me wretch. I am too pure for you or anyone. Your body hurts me as the world hurts God. I am a lantern. And then skipping a bit, I think I am going up. I think I may rise. And I guess I'll stop there. But similar themes of she says, am pure as acetylene, virgin, attended by roses, by kisses, by cherubim, by whatever these pink things mean. Pink things mean. So she like imagines herself going up into heaven
Mm.
in this state, and she like the words that she used. She says that even water makes her wretch for 3 days, so she hasn't eaten anything or probably drank anything, and she's burning up. She's like a lantern.
Mm. So it quite literally ends in light.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The last words of the poem are to paradise. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
she's not you, nor him, nor him, nor him. Myself dissolving, old whore petticoats to paradise.
Yeah.
Like this dissolving self.
Mm.
She imagines herself, finally dying.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I don't know. This is another poem like where I just think sonically it's so brilliant. And so I haven't had much of a chance to think about this poem deeply, so I don't think my comments are going to be very interesting. Um, but I like your interpretation. Um, yeah. So yeah. So like in terms of what I was talking about with what I like. So it's well anyway. Yeah.
There's not much to say about it. You know, I don't have much to say about it either.
I don't know. It's like yeah. So I feel like well, okay. So since we've talked about all six poems, I think our runtime as we've gone along has gotten shorter because I think there are a lot of there are so many echoes between them that probably, you know, a lot of the stuff we said about the first poem we talked about apply to a lot of the others, so we just didn't feel like repeating them. But so to talk about the book as a whole, since that was kind of our plan to start with the particular poems and then move out to the book as a whole, we have well, we have body horror, like you were talking about, which I find very interesting and I hadn't thought of. We have the sort of loss of self, I guess, and desire for kind of oneness with the universe, but not in the sort of transcendent way that term is usually used, in a more kind of I want to not exist, please, kind of sense. We have theater.
Mm-hmm.
With life as theater in a sense.
And the objectifying gaze.
Yeah. And
marriage as like a trap, domesticity as like confining you.
Yeah.
And I keep coming back to, when I read Sylvia Plath, I keep coming back to this idea that so many artists and poets have like glorified and sung about violence and like war and brutality. And Sylvia Plath does it, but it's aimed at herself. You know, she's like, she celebrates a kind of violence towards her own body, and it's so intense, you know, and obviously you might say it's horrifying, but it's like, it's powerful. It's like wild, you know?
Yeah. But it sort of ends, you know, even though it's so dark and it explores these themes of wanting to die and self-harm and other things, it does sort of end. I mean, it ends in light in a way, like Fever ends with her becoming a lamp. And there does seem to be something optimistic about that in a way,
Right.
Despite, I mean, forgetting the way her life ended. We just forget about that.
And Lady Lazarus also.
Sorry?
You push back the first time with the ending of Lady Lazarus, right? She ends by saying, I rise like a phoenix, and I eat men like air, you know?
Yeah.
So you're right. There it's more complex than that, for sure.
Well, cool. Yeah.
This was fun.
Yeah. So yeah, cool.
Should we wrap it up?
Shall I? Yeah, I suppose. So anyway, I will stop the recording. So thank you all for watching. If you've been watching us talk about this, and leave comments if you have thoughts. And yeah, talk to you all later.